Sounds good. Um, well, yeah, thanks for tuning in. My name is Alyssa Diacono. I am the coach at MIT, the men's water polo coach at MIT, and I will be talking about kind of conditioning and ways to kind of plan your season or just some things to think about. But I think the biggest thing is like I'm definitely not an expert or anything like that. So everything I'm talking about, I've kind of taken from someone else or things like that. And if you guys have questions at any point, feel free to chime in. So, just kind of like an overview, I'll go over my background, kind of my philosophy when it comes to conditioning, just kind of the overall demands of water polo, a brief science lesson because I think that's there's some pretty good data out there in regards to conditioning and things like that we can keep in mind. And then kind of going through how we can keep things simple, safe, and strategic while planning our conditioning sets. And then we'll have some time for questions. So just a really quick overview. I played at San Diego State. And then I also played professionally in Australia and Malta. I was a grad assistant at Mercyhurst. I got my master's in organizational leadership, which was pretty cool. My undergrad from San Diego State was in public health. So I actually wanted to be a nurse originally and then pivoted to the water polo world. So the science component of things is really interesting to me in the body. And so that applies to conditioning, which is cool. And then I founded the men's and women's team at Mount St. Mary's before coming to MIT, but I do have my NASM certification as a certified personal trainer, as well as my nutrition certification, as well as my CrossFit level 1. So some of the things I'm saying, I've gone through courses and things like that as well. So I think my philosophy when it comes to conditioning is keep it simple, keep it safe, and keep it strategic. I think there's a lot of information out there, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram and things like that, of like the newest fads or fashions and things like that. We see some crazy things with bands or kettlebells. And I think it's important to know that doing just the simple things works really well. So kind of just to start, just kind of looking at the overall demands of water polo. We have our explosive power, we have our sustained endurance, and then we also have like rotational stability. So when we're looking at these three different components, we want to consider, what we are doing in our everyday practice that kind of help us hit each of these areas. So explosive power, we're thinking like quick sprints over our hips. We have our vertical game, which is shot blocking. We have shooting, horizontal game, which is swimming, but it's also, drive defense, center defender work, things like that. So when we're thinking of explosive power and how we can implement that into our conditioning, we can think about things like doing ladders, short sprints, using passing as conditioning. I think passing is oftentimes overlooked, and it's like, okay, you guys have 5 minutes to pass on your own, but like how can we use even the 5 to 10 minutes of passing as leg conditioning, whether that's explosive power, on the whistle. You guys are going to, maintain your highest elevation for 20 seconds. And then on the second whistle, you guys will pass at a regular height for a minute. And so when we're thinking of explosive power, we also have to have the understanding that we can't maintain the same explosiveness over like a long duration of time. So you're, again, like 5, 10, 15 seconds, probably at the max. And then the next piece is the sustained endurance. So thinking, kind of the ability to play 4 quarters, the ability to play 2 or 3 games a day. I think each level brings a different type of endurance required, and every team is going to look different. So whether you're coaching, age group, which is club or middle school, high school, college, anything like that. I think it's important. Everyone's going to have a little bit of a different setup. So, for club, I feel like when we're, an age group, it's pretty normal to play 2 to 3 games a day, but sometimes you have 18 to 20 people on your roster. So that endurance, you're not expecting one athlete to be playing, 12 quarters, 16 quarters of water polo a day. Whereas maybe you get to a higher level or further into the weekend and your bench shortens, like now we have 5 or 6 athletes that are required to play 4 to 8, almost full quarters. So how can we kind of set them up for success? And one of my favorite drills is called the 4-quarter drill. So it's, in college, we play 8-minute quarters. So we go 4 8-minute quarters. We have 2 minutes of rest between each quarter, 3 minutes at halftime. And it's 8 minutes of work. And so we vary that between, it can be a 25, it could be 16 25s on the 30, and you're sprinting your 25s, and the remaining time you're doing jumps or some sort of leg set. You could gear this towards passing. So, maybe you do 1 quarter of hard swimming, and then you're following it by 8 minutes of high intensity passing, followed by swimming, followed by, more passing, or whether that's shooting, but trying to use your conditioning to your advantage. I think a lot of us are in a situation where, we don't have 6 hours a day with our athletes. So it's like, how do we make the best out of our 90 minutes to 120-minute practice, 3, 4, 5 times a week? Like most of us aren't training at that professional level. So we don't have time to swim, 5,000 yards in the morning, and then they get to come back, and then we get to play water polo. So it's like, how do I use 20 to 30 minutes in my 2-hour practice to really get after conditioning without losing, what we need to do with the ball or tactics or things like that. And then I think the last piece, which usually goes under the radar, but like the rotational stability that water polo requires. And a lot of that comes from our core. And that rotational stability is pretty much the foundation of most movements in our sport. So, effective shooting, passing, shot blocking, egg beatering, things like that, over our hips, everything comes back to the core. And I think, swim does a pretty good job at, when they're doing dry land and things like that. When you're looking at these swim teams, a lot of it's core related. And I think we get away from that sometimes. So the more that we can work on our core in dry land or even in the water, I think the better it is for the athletes as well. Any questions on any of that? Awesome. So this is I'm gonna like kind of be a little bit of a nerd for a second, but I'm gonna give just kind of a brief overview of the different energy systems essentially. And water polo is one of the hardest sports that there is. And part of the reason is because that requires us to be really efficient in each of the different energy systems. So within our, within biology and things like that, so we have our creatine phosphate system. And so that is 10 to 15 seconds of really hard, fast energy. We can't maintain this level of output for very long. So, you're thinking the sprint. So if your athlete is the one doing the sprint, you're thinking of the 5 to 10 seconds prior to shooting during a shot. That 5 to 10 seconds in counterattack transition. But again, this is like the fastest and simplest way to generate energy, essentially. And I think it's important that we practice this, right? So if you do have athletes that are the ones that are usually doing your sprint off, or, within those 5 to 10 seconds of the first wave of your counterattack, like, are you helping your athletes kind of develop that conditioning, what that output should feel like in your conditioning setting? And then the limitation of this, though, is we can't do it for a very long amount of time, right? So, your athlete that's sprinting isn't going to be able to maintain that level of output for the entire game, but like, can we make them really good for 10 to 15 seconds before they move into their next energy system? And then the next energy, so this is one that probably people more know about, but like the anaerobic. So you're thinking like without oxygen. So this goes from pretty much 15 seconds to 2 minutes. So this is why a lot of times our athletes are really good in 2-minute bursts. Because this is they have the ATP, they have that energy to like maintain their high level of fitness in those moments. So again, you're thinking 2 minutes of counterattack, you're thinking about 2 minutes in a high intensity shooting drill. But if we're not competing in practice for a hard 2 minutes at a time, it's going to be really hard for our athletes to perform in a game for those 2 minutes at a really high level. And so again, that's why it's important, like we have to practice how we play, like setting up our athletes for success, give them opportunities in practice, in conditioning, to go really hard for only 10 seconds. Like give them opportunities where we're going to counterattack for 2 minutes. One of my favorite drills I like to do even at the college level is we're playing for 3 minutes and that's it. So they know for 3 minutes that they can go all out, give 100%, and then they have 5 to 6 minutes of rest. Again, so it's training them to be able to play at a really high level and high energy output. And part of that too is starting to train their brain to like process and think when they're really tired. I think a lot of us can relate to the fact, like when they get tired or when we get tired, it's, our thinking tends to slip a little bit. So being able to mimic that in practice is important. And then your aerobic system. So this is, again, you're thinking, like anaerobic too would be, I think in common terms, more like a HIIT cycle. That's pretty common right now. And then where aerobic is more of your like low intensity, but you can maintain it. It's also why water polo is one of the hardest sports, is because we're supposed to maintain, pretty high output throughout the 4-quarter game. And for us, even when we're resting, for the most part, we're still egg beatering. So we're still constantly using energy. Whereas if you're playing soccer and there's a timeout, you're truly at rest. But for us, our rest, we're still moving and things like that. And so this is the system where we're thinking 10 100s, 10 200s, being able to play, 4 quarters for 15 minutes, running clock, things like that. And this is also really important in the conditioning piece as well. I think a lot of times we get stuck more in the aerobic system when we're thinking of our traditional conditioning. And so again, I think it's just important that we kind of hit each of these three buckets at least once a week. So examples. So again, like I kind of talked about for your first one. So like you're thinking 10 to 14 seconds of really high power. So starting a sprint, jumping and shooting or shot blocking, your initial transition. And then as far as like your anaerobic state, like your counterattacks, your short swims with ample rest. So working for 2 minutes, maybe it's 450s on a fast interval followed by a good bit of rest. And then as far as the aerobic system, anything that's going beyond 2 minutes, right? So continuous swimming and scrimmaging, your interval training, essentially any passing shooting drill that you do that's not requiring them to be performing at their peak will kind of fall into that aerobic system. So now I'm going to kind of transition to like, well, now what, right? So keep it simple. Like I said, I think we're in a day and age where it's like, what's the next best thing? And keeping it simple usually works the best. And I know that athletes tend to have a hard time buying into this because they're like, well, on Instagram or TikTok, we saw, X, Y, and Z do this, but, the science and the data, like keep it simple. As far as mobility and activation, there are, hundreds of YouTube videos out there and things like that. But the main thing when we're thinking about like mobility and activation are, are your shoulders ready to move? Are your hips ready to move? And is your core activated? And like part of this too is, we coming up with like a pre-practice routine or stretching or things like that, but kind of priming your body to be ready to jump in the pool. A lot of times I see people like doing more stagnant stretching and things like that. The data and the science behind it is like prior to jumping in the pool, prior to a hard workout, like we should kind of be activating our muscles. We should be moving. And then maybe after practice, we can do more of a stagnant stretch. So, we're going to get in and we're going to be doing a hard swim set. Like, let's make sure we're activated. We have our mobility, our shoulders are warm, our hips are warm. Our heart rate got up. Our heart rate was elevated at some point prior to us jumping in the pool. The next thing I think too, like when we're thinking about conditioning is obviously swimming, but we have our dry land and our weight room opportunities, and not everyone has, the equipment or the weight room or the space. But even when it comes to dry land, like thinking about how those movements should complement what we do in the pool and should not mimic the same movements that we're constantly doing in the pool, which would eventually kind of lead to overuse and injury. So for example, a lot of the movement we're doing in the pool is, overhead. It's a lot of shoulder. It's a lot of chest. So good kind of complementary movements to that, or working on our back, our scap. So, bent over rows, anything with scap work, with bands, things like that. It's important to warm up our shoulders, but it's not like we need to have our athletes be maxing out on a bench press, because we already have so much more strength in kind of the front plane of our body just based on all of the overhead movement. And I think one of the best examples someone gave me is we almost need to treat water polo players like they're conditioning like they're swimmers, throwing like they're pitchers, but have the physicality of rugby players. And so finding a balance of what that looks like in the weight room can be really challenging. But just being really careful that anything you should be doing in the weight room or in dry land should be enhancing the student athlete or the athlete's ability to play the sport. It shouldn't be deterring from it. There's a time and a place to be bodybuilders and things like that. And we can kind of talk about that a little bit later when we're talking about like training cycles and things like that. But the like weight room and dry land, when it comes to conditioning, should always complement what we're trying to do in the pool. And then keeping it simple in the pool. So whether that's swim conditioning, whether it's water polo, if the goal is more water polo, like, and we only have 2 hours, trying to make our conditioning more water polo specific. So water polo specific swim sets, stations are really good, leg sets, things like that. We can, like I said before, use passing as a leg set. It's one of my favorite things, 15 seconds on, 30 seconds off, kind of get their legs going. It's kind of like secret legs. I consider counterattack and controlled scrimmage secret swimming. Like, you're going to get a lot of buy-in from the athletes if you are going to say, hey, we're passing today, for 30 minutes versus like, okay, we're going to have a weight belt on for 30 minutes. Same thing, like if we're doing counterattack, they're thinking water polo, they're thinking we get to use a ball and we're shooting, but we can really, make sure it's geared towards, your first 5 to 6 strokes are going to be really hard. This is the focus of this counterattack drill today. The next piece is trying to keep it safe. So I think 3 big things. So just know your athletes, what age group are you coaching? What part of the season are you in? What do your athletes do away from the pool? I think is a really important one. Like, are your athletes that are coming to water polo also going to swim 3 times a week? Are your athletes not doing anything between the time you see them, right? And that's going to help you set up your conditioning to kind of better serve your athletes. Obviously, if they're swimming 3 times a week and they come to you, you get to probably play a little bit more water polo and gear it towards more water polo specific. And then if you don't see that, if they don't do anything between, the time they see you, you're going to have to make sure you're a little bit safer when it comes to conditioning and not injuring them as well. And then kind of what time of year is it? So are you in season? Are you out of season? Are you practicing? Are you in doubles? Are you in singles? Kind of, those questions are really help kind of form your conditioning plan. And then when it comes to the acclimation period, this and the 10% rule kind of go hand in hand, but I think it's important. A lot of times we see like Hell Week or preseason's a really good example. A lot of times athletes aren't doing the same amount of volume going into what they're going to be going through during our preseason, during Hell Week. And we see a lot of injuries that first week. So there's a transition period, especially for first years. So if you are coaching high school as like they're the freshmen, in college they're the freshmen, but even age group and things like that, these are the athletes that have come to you. They haven't really played water polo before, or they've taken a long break and things like that. There's a transition period of about 4 weeks where we should kind of be, I would say like acclimating them back into the sport. Like, the science and the data says let's in the first 4 days like of a preseason, those are the days the athletes are most susceptible to injury. So just making sure you have a plan that on day one, day one's not the test set. Day one, we're not swimming 6,000 yards. And then in the afternoon, scrimmaging for 3 hours. So just keeping in mind, like it does take our bodies 4 weeks to transition. It's a good base too of, in the weight room, usually every 4 weeks you can max out and things like that. There's a 4-week period of where your body is actually kind of getting used to your workload. And then keeping in mind, like those first 4 days of practice of a season are really important and can kind of set your season up for success, or maybe not as successful because you come about a lot of injuries early on. And then like any athlete that's out for 2 weeks because of injury should also follow that 4-week transition period in the conditioning world as well, just to avoid more injury. And then the 10% rule comes from the like more from the running world, but it applies to us as well. So your goal should be to increase your yardage or things like that on a 10% basis. So if week 1 you're swimming a total of 10,000 yards, week 2 we're looking at swimming 11,000 yards. And that's just kind of a good rule of thumb as well to make sure you're managing injuries and things like that, especially with athletes specializing in sports earlier. We're seeing more overuse injuries and things like that. So hopefully kind of this goes with that 4-week transition period. You're avoiding the bicep tendonitis, the shoulder impingement, things like that. But just kind of keeping that in mind that, if you're going to swim like 5,000 yards in the first 3 days, like, maybe day 4, 5, and 6, we're also not swimming 5,000 yards. So just kind of keeping that in mind while you're planning. And then keep it strategic. So there are different training cycles, and essentially, you have a macro cycle, which is essentially your 12-month plan. You have a mesocycle, which is your monthly, and then you have a microcycle, which is your weekly. So big words to say, not a whole, like not super important meanings, but I always think it's really important to sit down and look at your season long, or, essentially calendar long year, and just kind of break it up into sections. So I'm going to use college water polo for an example. We play in the fall. So my goal at the beginning of every season, I look at the 12 months. So I know from August till December, or end of August till beginning of December, we're going to be in season. I know that from December till essentially February, March for MIT, I'm not going to see them a whole lot. We have 16 practices, and then they go off for the summer and they have internships. So that's kind of how I look at my macro cycle. And then you can break it down into like a monthly. So obviously in season, I see them the most. That's where the most training, most planning goes into it. So I look at 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and to see what that can look like. So for example, Our D3 national championship aligns with NCAA national championships, which is the first weekend December. So I need us to be playing our best possible water polo by the end of November, early December. So if I'm working backwards from that, every 4 to 6 weeks, I'm essentially will kind of teeter off at the closer we get to national championships. But my first 4 to 6 weeks, even if we're having games, so August and September, we're playing tired. Like that's the goal. We're using our games as part of conditioning. We're not supposed to be playing our best water polo. The goal is to be getting better every day. Then we kind of head into October. We're still getting better. We're kind of still pushing the conditioning, but now maybe we're pulling back on the true swimming, the true conditioning, and emphasizing a little bit more tactics, things like that. So that way into November and December, it's more of a maintenance. We will still swim, we'll still condition, but the conditioning is going to be more water polo related as far as scrimmaging, counterattack, things like that. So that way we're kind of getting ready for our championships. And then if you're looking on a weekly plan, this kind of comes down to we'll play Saturdays and Sundays. Mondays are our off day. And then I want to make sure we're playing at peak, the most rested come Saturday and Sunday. So Tuesday and Wednesday are usually a little bit harder. We'll still condition through Tuesday and Wednesday. And then Thursday we'll pull back on the conditioning component and really focus more 6-on-5, 6-on-6. And then Friday is we're going to get our heart rates up for 10 to 12 minutes. That's about a quarter long. And then we're going to really focus on our tactics for the weekend. And I think the important thing is we do lift Tuesdays and Thursdays throughout the entire season. I think there's been back and forth on what that looks like, but even at the highest level, you're even looking at, when you're looking at the NFL, you still have athletes in the weight room the week of the Super Bowl. So there are smart ways to continue to train to keep your central nervous system alert. And obviously based on athletes, based on programs, there can be different types of tapering systems and things like that. So now kind of more of like the conditioning phases, there's different levels. So you'll have like stabilization, we have our strength, and we have our power. And so when you're looking at conditioning and okay, so what should I be doing in what part of my season? This is where that macro cycle, the microcycles, and the mesocycles are just important so that you can align each phase with that different time of the year. So if we're working backwards, your power cycle is actually the cycle that you will be in during season. I coach a men's team. They all want to lift really heavy weights, but the rule is in season is not the time to be putting on 20 to 30 pounds of muscle. In season is the time to perform at the highest possible level and be the best water polo athlete you can be. So what that looks like is, fast. It's powerful. It's usually it can be a little bit heavier weight, less reps, but we're moving for speed. We're moving for explosiveness. And again, this primes your nervous system to pretty much stay alert. Anything we do from box jumps to squats to even benching, overhead press, things like that, there's an explosive nature to it, just to keep your body ready and to kind of maintain the muscle that or the strength that you've worked on prior to season. So working backwards, spring and summer is where the strength component really comes in. So based on when your season is pre to preseason, so not true preseason to your season, but prior to season is where you can kind of emphasize building the muscle, lifting heavier, doing more reps, maybe lifting 3 or 4 times a week. But again, you're maximizing your strength here. And then phase 1, which is stabilization. So for me, that would be more of my winter break, early spring for the guys. Like, they're coming off a season. We don't want to injure them and just have them go max out right away because they haven't maxed out in 6 months. So really focusing on low weight, high reps, slow tempo, like getting back to the basics of like, this is how we squat properly, this is how we hinge. And that's to minimize the risk and again, kind of set them up for success heading into their spring and summer where they are lifting a little bit heavier. In terms of water polo conditioning and swimming, again, the in-season component is it's less about increasing, like obviously hopefully they're going to get in better shape and things like that, but in season is not the time where we're dropping 6 seconds in our 100 or 200 free. We're really working on maintenance and maintaining explosive power. Come again preseason, so like spring and the summer, that's where I encourage the guys, like that's where we can do a 3,000 4,000 yard swim set. You're building your leg strength. You guys can do med balls in the water. We can put weight belts on. This is like true you can kind of put yourself through the grind here. And then for them, like when they go home for winter break, early spring, it's just like continue moving in the water. And that's kind of what that looks like as far as in the water conditioning. Are there any questions on anything I said there? Awesome. So the next thing is I will just show you kind of a couple of the swim sets I have created, and then kind of show you also like preseason, kind of what my preseason looks like. So these are examples of like winter break workouts. I also will kind of use these in season to kind of modify and things like that, but just different examples of, adding some water polo movements in there, some variability. I also like to say whenever we're writing conditioning sets, the goal is to make sure if you were to get in the water, you would be willing to do it. I think sometimes that gets lost on us as coaches, but just kind of going through the outline, like there's always some type of warm up, and that's going to prime us for our main set. So if we're going to be working on IM, hopefully incorporating some stroke in our warm up. This one is based on rest. So encouraging them to kind of, work at their own pace. This is a good one if they are not in the best shape or they're not sure what kind of time to do their hundreds and 50s and things like that on. That's a good example. We have ones where we're working on each 25 getting faster. So again, working on that aerobic state here. A lot of these sets are more aerobic just because of the length of them. But then this one, for example, you're increasing your 50 kick, your 50 free, a little bit more rest. So you're trying to push the speed there. And then the other thing too that I think is super important is, we can, the sweet spot I think of swimming for water polo is about 2,000 to 3,000 yards, and then always making sure you're doing some type of leg set as well. So whether that's with different jugs, this one is no equipment, so just elbows out, arms out, working between your vertical breaststroke and your egg beater. And then we have our kick set in there as well. So those are just a couple examples of some swim sets that I've kind of created there. And then the last thing is just going through, let me see. So just kind of going through, like, whenever I am writing a practice, just making sure there is some type of progression and kind of purpose to the conditioning as well. So this is our preseason. Our goal was press. That's an afternoon practice, so there was less conditioning. But so this was day one of our preseason. We had a warm up. So again, if I'm giving an athlete 5 minutes, they get to kind of choose their own pace. Everyone warms up at a different rate. Some people like to sprint, some people like to move pretty slow. So instead of us waiting for everyone to finish a 300, we have 5 minutes swim. So again, kind of including different movements within our warm-up that's going to prime us for what we're doing for the day. And again, we were doing a 12-minute AMRAP, so just as many rounds as they could within those 12 minutes. It allows athletes to work at different speeds. So if you have a more conditioned athlete, they're able to work at a faster pace, but still working for 12 minutes. So everyone's finishing on time. You stay on track with practice. And then we did, 6 100s on the 2 minutes with different variables within that, followed by some legs. So that was in a morning, and then afternoon we worked on counterattack. So that was kind of our secret swimming conditioning for there. Day two, for example, we did our warm up. So similar concept, an allotment of time for your warm up, and then we did stations. I love stations. You get to do a lot of different movements, again, on a set amount of time, so you're staying on track, but you kind of get to hit different areas. So using bungee cords, so 4 strokes, 4 knockdowns, 15 seconds of rest, kind of on repeat. You can do med balls, ladders, kilo balls over the hips, anything that you think that your team needs. It's a good way to kind of hit those different areas. They're working for 4 minutes. You could also do these stations where it's only 2 minutes, so it's a really, really high input, high output, and then they're resting for 4 minutes. So kind of encouraging that high intensity there. And then this was the afternoon. So again, less conditioning. Day 2 of preseason, not looking to hurt them or anything, but we transitioned to some 6-on-5 as our conditioning through there. So those are a couple examples. Obviously there's a lot more that you can go into in regards to conditioning. But I will kind of wrap it up there and open it to any questions.
Do you usually teach a lot of your athletes some of this background science when you go through it? Have you found that to be helpful?
Yeah. So I also coach very intelligent, highly functioning student athletes who are amazing, but they like to know the why behind everything. So I usually break it down this is why we're doing this test set today. Like, we're doing 5 quarters actually instead of 4 because of an overtime situation. Or, today our leg set's going to be passing. Our goal is to work really hard for 15 seconds and you're going to get a lot more rest. So I think anytime that you can educate the athletes and kind of tell them the why behind it, they tend to buy in and actually work harder.
It's good to know.